Reptile Society.
HP Lovecraft. Weird fiction. That is, fiction that blends the traditional sense of the word weird, such as the paranormal or the occult, with science fiction and horror. Yes, nearly everyone knows of the Call of Cthulhu and his other Old One characters. But he also had some great conceptual stories about dreams, but he was also a poet. There are a good amount of his works that aren't as appreciated as his Cthulhu mythos. And sometimes going back to the early 1900s, the writing can be a bit of a shock for modern audiences. And I don't just mean the subject matter, but the prose itself. Yeah, Lovecraft loved science, but sometimes his stories can read like a science textbook.
We cannot yet explain the engineering principles used in the anomalous balancing and adjustment of the vast rock masses, though the function of the arch was clearly much relied on.
So people were able to appreciate his works through other means. Movies and video games were adapted for a much wider audience and appreciation. I'm sure Lovecraft would have loved that too. He had a unique position of being a mentor to fellow writers, as he encouraged them to expand upon the universe he created. His writings were rich with sigils, creatures, deities, theories, and other writers came and expanded upon that. I would say it wasn't until the 1980s that his stories really began to become cult classics. And since then, his stories and characters only got more and more popular each year. Today we see things like plushes and tabletop games, movies, video games, of course. So let's take a look at some video games influenced by HP Lovecraft. So let's start from the beginning. The very first video game based on Lovecraft I could find. Back in the 80s, DOS had quite a few text-based games, which makes sense. One of these was the 1987 release, The Lurking Horror, based on Lovecraft's short story, The Lurking Fear. In The Lurking Horror, players read and respond. Games like these can be beat pretty quickly if you're privy to what needs to be typed exactly. Otherwise, they can be pretty fun to work out and take a good amount of time to beat. In the game, a student in a computer lab encounters some lurking horror coming from beneath the school he's at. He works with the hacker to uncover all sorts of eldritch horrors hidden beneath the school. In The Lurking Fear, the school setting and student characters are instead a creepy old mansion and a paranormal thrill seeker of sorts. The Martens mansion, situated atop of Tempest Mountain in the Catskill, has a bit of a mystery going on. So a reporter and two bodyguards check out the mansion and all sorts of horrors take place. So much like the game, creatures lurk beneath the mansion, though the story plays out much more darker than the computer game, which is a bit more playful. It does a great job at exploring the human psyche and fear, sanity or insanity. It's a constant theme throughout Lovecraft. What The Lurking Fear does great is take some earlier influence from the likes of Poe, such as the Telltale Heart, and expands on the topic of psychology that Poe wrote about. Lovecraft was able to explore the human mind in ways that are perhaps more terrifying than the creatures in these stories. Another game with a very similar premise is Alone in the Dark, released in 1992 for DOS, and many other systems. As a child, this game scared me so much, but when you play it today, it isn't exactly traumatizing, but it's still great, spooky fun. It's hard for a lot of people to go back to these types of games. The graphics are dated. This was 92. Other games looked like this, but Alone in the Dark not only looked much more advanced, it was one of the earliest examples of survival horror and was the main inspiration for Resident Evil. But even great influences are influenced themselves, and Alone in the Dark is pretty much just a retelling of The Lurking Fear. Play as either Detective Edward Carnby or Emily Hartwood to solve the supposed suicide of Jeremy Hartwood in the Decreto Mansion. Edward Carnby, kind of like Edward Derby in The Thing on the Doorstep, and Emily Hartwood, Lovecraft. Anyway, all sorts of creatures jump out at you. This window scene is a classic jump scare. I love that music too. Night gaunts make an appearance in this game, and it's one of my favorite poems by HP Lovecraft. You don't see them depicted very often. The mansion is infested with interdimensional creatures lurking beneath. HP Lovecraft wrote a short story about Dagons, a fish-like creature, kind of like the creature from the Black Lagoon. Well, it's in this game as well. At the root of all this evil, a pirate named...
As it shipwrecked.
He becomes a spirit trapped in a tree, kind of like Lovecraft's The Tree. The Lurking Fear definitely helped shape Alone in the Dark, especially with the themes of, well, fear playing a major factor. So there's also some Edgar Allan Poe influences in Alone in the Dark, which makes sense since Poe was a major influence on Lovecraft. As for Alone in the Dark, I wouldn't bother with any of the remakes or the direct sequels, or even the movie for that matter, as none of those are rich in Lovecraft lore like the first one.
My dear Alex, I will always be at your side.
Poe and Lovecraft were a major influence for a video game creator, Dennis Dyack, from Silicon Knights. Silicon Knights would go on to make Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem for the Nintendo GameCube. It's also one of the very first mature-rated Nintendo games, and it's pretty much the definition of a cult classic. And yet again, another game influenced by The Lurking Fear. Though Dyack, being a DOS nerd, was definitely influenced by The Lurking Horror and Alone in the Dark as well. We have yet again another mansion with an interdimensional city hidden beneath. But Eternal Darkness goes above and beyond that. It has many influences from Lovecraft and Poe, but never directly references Lovecraft's universe at all. Instead, Dyack wrote a story that plays like an alternate version of a Lovecraft story. Lots of familiar themes and creatures, but they're all original. Much like the great old ones in Lovecraft, Cthulhu, Yig, Nyarlathotep, Eternal Darkness has its own slew of old ones, but they are called the Ancients. Get it? The first three are battling for control of the cosmos. Pius Augustus, the main antagonist of the game, stumbles upon a forbidden city in Persia back in 26 BC, the earliest moment from the game. He becomes corrupted when he chooses an essence representing one of the three ancients by color. Through the many different eras played out in the game, many mortals are chosen to battle against the forces of Pius and the ancients, with the aid of the Tome of Eternal Darkness, much like Necronomicon. Most of these characters are killed, though enough survive to bring together artifacts that allow the main protagonist, Alex Roivas, to travel to a city beneath her grandfather's mansion to destroy Pius Augustus and the ongoing battle for the universe. The game takes place in 4 different areas: a temple in Cambodia, the Forbidden City in Persia or Iran, depending on the timeline, a cathedral in France, and the Roivas Mansion in Providence, Rhode Island. The use of fear in this game is unlike any other game, and nothing has really been able to replicate it since. The characters deal with fear in the situations they are doomed to be in, represented by a sanity meter. What makes this brilliant is that this can also affect the player as well. So something like the character's head falling off or seemingly dying can occur, though it doesn't really happen. Other things like the simulation of a television being turned off or muted, or save data being deleted can also occur. It's a great way to keep players on their toes without being straight up jump scares, though that can happen in the game as well.
That is the question.
What Lovecraft created with The Lurking Fear was a psychological thriller of sorts, though in a weird way was grounded in reality, with the focus being on sanity. Eternal Darkness is 100% an analogy of the human psyche and its relationship to sanity, or lack thereof. I mean, the subtitle of the game is Sanity's Requiem. Out of all the Lovecraft-based games, Eternal Darkness is probably the best experience to really playing through a Lovecraftian-like world, though the lack of any direct connection, that could certainly put some fans off. Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth, released on the original Xbox in 2005. This one connects directly to Lovecraft's story, The Shadow over Innsmouth. In that story, a detective is tasked with entering a strange town in Massachusetts. He speaks with some citizens, he learns more uncertain facts about the town that begin to bother him. When he speaks to a 96-year-old man, he finds out that there's an old sea captain who is in cahoots with a group of creatures, deep ones, and offers human sacrifices. The detective gets stuck in town following bus troubles that prevent him from leaving, but in the middle of the night, he discovers a group of deep ones which frightens him. So the story ups the mystery and weirdness, and the secret cults are all interesting, but perhaps what shadows over this story today is the blatant racism. Like many stories centuries old at this point, a lot of themes haven't aged well. It's not like Lovecraft was exactly a household name to begin with. Instead, his writings were seen mostly in magazines. But still, this story exhibits themes that just wouldn't fly today. It's more or less the same story, but it's like when a movie is an adaptation of a book. It doesn't capture everything that's in the book, but with the video game, there is much more added that isn't in the short story. Some things are different and other aspects are tweaked a little. For example, the detective in the short story faints upon seeing the deep ones, but in the video game, the detective faints in the beginning of the game, but the rest is intact, the detective getting clues about the strange town, being stuck in town and forced to stay in a hotel. But where the short story ends, the video game continues. Deep ones are involved, but it's much more than that. There are references to Dagon, Shoggoth, Cthulhu. Makes me wonder the mental state of this detective after seeing the creature early on in the game makes him question his own sanity throughout the game, which was inspired by a separate story by Lovecraft, The Shadow Out of Time.
I do not know. If that abyss and what it held were real, there is no hope. Then, all too truly, there lies upon this world of man a mocking and incredible shadow out of time.
I should also note that this is Bethesda, the same team behind Skyrim and Fallout and all those games. So it kind of plays like Fallout, you talk to whoever, but less action-oriented and more detective and survival horror based. The newest example of a Lovecraft game is The Sinking City, another detective survival horror game. It takes place in, surprise, Massachusetts. Unlike Dark Corners of the Earth, Sinking City is upfront about the racism in Lovecraft's writings. This right here is how you present something to a modern audience, while keeping authenticity. I like to call it the Looney Tunes disclaimer. Yeah, those Warner Brother cartoons did the same thing, when the old cartoons were released on DVD. In hindsight, these things are obviously offensive, but we can't just sweep things under the rug or pretend they never existed. All of that aside, the game kinda reminds me of Wind Waker. You'll be in a boat for most of the game, which isn't very exciting. Whereas Eternal Darkness is much more action-oriented, especially with the use of magic. Sinking City is focused mainly on detective gameplay. The story becomes a bit of a mess, though, which is a shame, since the setting and history from when Lovecraft wrote the original story provides more than enough inspiration for what this team was going for. A lot of the ideas fall flat. Probably the weirdest one of the bunch is codenamed Steam on 3DS. Where do I even begin? First of all, you play as Henry Fleming, as in the main protagonist found in Stephen Crane's Civil War novel, The Red Badge of Courage. And you battle against aliens in a steampunk world. That's not all, though. Your partner, American folk legend John Henry, aids you alongside Dorothy, the Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow from the Oz series. Oh, and Tiger Lily from Peter Pan, and Tom Sawyer from Tom Sawyer. And Abraham Lincoln battles a Shoggoth, a creature from the Lovecraft mythos, as detailed in At the Mountains of Madness. You see, Shoggoth and a legion of interdimensional aliens have invaded Earth to take the Necronomicon. Randolph Carter contacts Abe Lincoln for help, the same Randolph Carter that acts as a recurring character in many of Lovecraft's stories. And, well, there are more Oz characters thrown in there: Queen Elizabeth, Fire Emblem characters, a giant mech. It's a bizarre game for sure. The steampunk aesthetics add to the weirdness, and well, it's a fun game if you're into strategic action games. Randolph Carter appears in some of Lovecraft's dream cycle stories. Unlike his horror or cult stories, the dream cycles are much more descriptive and psychological. Many of the human characters are never quite certain about what they've experienced. These stories are very descriptive and very beautiful too. These dream cycles, dream stories, whatever you want to call them, could have been an inspiration for Earthbound. I didn't think much of it, but seeing this user's post on a StarNet forum made me think things. So here are some highlights that make for a compelling argument, and with that, I thank you for watching. Cthulhu goes by many different spellings. You can Google them. There are too many to list. Gigas, Gigas, however you want to pronounce it, goes by many spellings as well. The fact they both have numerous spellings isn't the connection. The connection is why they have numerous spellings. It is explained that Cthulhu is a word that humans cannot comprehend, and thus is why the spelling is different, as well as there being no true way to pronounce it. It's simply the best humans can do. I believe Gigas is the same way. Gigas is something far beyond what the normal mind can comprehend. When Cthulhu came to Earth, he brought along Cthulhu, which are much smaller versions of himself. In terms of the work of Lovecraft, not much is known about these Cthulhu that came with him and worked for him. Mother has Starmen, the group working closest to Gigas, and other than that, not much is known about them. Gigas has many alien races working for him: Starmen, Mooks, Shamblers, and all of these alien races are supposed to be a part of something much greater with a greater cosmic entity. You go deep into the bowels of the earth, into an ancient world. Lovecraft usually didn't give his heroes the benefit of other friendlies, well, that lived very long at least. You can go into the cave in the northwest and see the crashed remains of your ship from the past. You can see the bent metal pillar that identifies that location. There are images from a you from the past, and the foreshadowing is just so chilling. They represent so much horror, but they're so innocent. This is really the core of Lovecraft's stuff. He makes you feel so lonely and so weak and then forces you to keep moving forward. The pace of his books are slow, and that adds even more to the horror. You just have to keep walking and keep seeing more normal things, but each one has so many horrific connotations.